Maria Sharapova is standing courtside at the Lindner Family Tennis Center in Mason, Ohio, and for the first time in years, she looks like she doesn't know what's happening around her because she doesn't not until she sees the flags, thousands of them. An entire stand turned into a wave of blue, red, and gold, and here's a name being chanted so loudly the scoreboard might as well not exist. And somewhere in that noise, a 5-time Grand Slam champion, a woman who has stood inside the loudest arenas tennis has ever built, quietly realizes she has never seen anything quite like this before. So what exactly is happening in Cincinnati? And why does a legend who has witnessed every kind of fame the sport has to offer suddenly look like the one whose starstruck rewind 3 weeks? Toronto, Sobeys Stadium, 10,000 seats, and somehow it feels like 20,000 voices, because every single one of them is shouting the same 2 syllables over and over, a chant so relentless that people who had never heard of this player before that night suddenly can't stop asking who she is, and the answer on paper doesn't seem to explain any of it. She's ranked 17th. She's never won a major. She's not the top seed, not the defending champion, not even the highest-ranked player in her own match. And yet the walkways outside the stadium are lined before she even arrives. Banners raise children in replica kits, grown adults with tears already forming before a single ball has been struck. This isn't the reception, reserved for a rising player having a good season. This is the reception reserved for someone people have been waiting their entire lives to see. And that's the first crack in the story. Because if the rankings don't explain this reaction, something else has to. Cut to Cincinnati, days later, and it's happening again, not a smaller version of Toronto, not fans catching a wave, but the exact same intensity transplanted into a new city. Which means whatever this is, it isn't a fluke. It isn't a local moment, it's something that travels. Something that has roots deep enough to pull people out of their homes in Ohio, California, New York, driving for hours, flying across the country just to stand in a building and watch one player walk onto a court. Tournament director Bob Moran has run this event for years, has watched superstar after superstar come through those gates, and when reporters ask him about the ticket demand for this one player, he doesn't have a polished answer ready. He just says, "It was unbelievable," and leaves it at that. Because there isn't a clean statistic that captures what he watched happen at the box office. So who is she? Her name is Alex Eala, and if that name means nothing to you yet, that's exactly the point. Because millions of people on the other side of the world already know it by heart. She's Filipino, and the Philippines has never not once in its entire history produced a professional tennis star before her. Not a Grand Slam quarterfinalist, not a top 50 regular, nothing close. Which means every single milestone she hits isn't just a personal achievement. It's a national first, and that distinction is the hinge this entire story swings on. Because it explains why an entire diaspora, one of the largest in the United States, has effectively adopted her as their own. She picked up a racket at 4 years old. And by 2022, she'd become the first Filipino player ever to win a junior Grand Slam title. A moment that should have been the headline of her career, and instead turned out to be only the opening note. Because in March 2025, she walked into the Miami Open as a virtual unknown outside tennis circles and walked out of it having beaten 3 Grand Slam champions in a row, one of them the reigning Wimbledon champion. On her way to the semifinals, and if you think that's the twist, wait, because it isn't. That's just the moment the story started gaining momentum, not the moment it exploded. Fast forward, and she becomes the first Filipina in history to win a Grand Slam singles main draw match at the US Open. Another barrier that had simply never been broken before her, and then weeks before Cincinnati. She claims her first WTA Tour singles title in Washington, D.C., and it's at that exact tournament that something shifts. Because that's when the crowd stop being large and start being described by players themselves as unlike anything they've experienced. Jessica Pegula, standing at a podium giving her own runner-up speech, chooses to spend part of it acknowledging Eala'S presence in the tournament, an almost unheard-of gesture from a rival player mid-run. Coco Gauff, one of the faces of the entire sport, says publicly that Eala is bringing a demographic to tennis that simply wasn't there before. Naomi Osaka, a 4-time major champion who understands global fame better than almost anyone alive, starts talking about the sheer scale of the Filipino fan base that follows Eala from city to city, city to city. And Andy Roddick, never one to hand out praise lightly, doesn't just compliment her, he gives the phenomenon a name. He calls it Elamania, and he says it with the kind of grin that suggests he knows exactly what he's watching. Something that could pull hundreds of millions of new fans into a sport that has been trying to expand its footprint in Asia for decades, and never quite managed it. Former British #1 Greg Rusetsky goes even further, comparing the raw force of the Filipino fan support to the Serena Williams era, and if that comparison sounds like an exaggeration, sit with it for a second, because nobody compares anything to the Serena Williams era casually. So the pieces start coming together. A historic first, a country starving for a global sports icon, a diaspora spread across the world ready to rally behind her the moment she gave them a reason. But that still doesn't fully explain why Maria Sharapova, of all people, is the one standing in Cincinnati looking genuinely stunned. And this is where the story turns personal, because weeks earlier, after Eala pulled off a historic Wimbledon win over defending champion Iga Swiatek, Sharapova did something nobody expected. She left a comment on Wimbledon's own Instagram post. Just 2 words and a single star emoji, nothing more. It should have been forgettable. One legend's passing acknowledgement of a rising talent, the kind of thing that happens online 100 times a day and means almost nothing. Except it didn't feel like nothing to Eala. When she was asked about it later, she didn't play it down. She said Sharapova was her childhood idol, someone she'd looked up to before she'd even dreamed this career was possible. And that having her notice, having her comment, felt like a validation she hadn't known she was still chasing. A little girl who once watched Sharapova from a television screen, from a stand from a distance she assumed would always exist between them, suddenly had that same legend typing her name into a comment box. And now that same legend is standing feet away from her in Cincinnati, not watching from a broadcast booth, not offering a polite quote to a reporter, but physically present, absorbing a wall of noise she didn't generate and clearly wasn't expecting. Because Sharapova has seen superstars rise and fall for 2 decades, she knows exactly what manufactured hype looks like, and she knows exactly what real, uncontrollable grassroots devotion looks like. And the fact that this particular wave of it catches her off guard is the detail that should stop you cold. Because it means even someone who has lived inside global fame is looking at this and recognizing it as something different, something bigger than the sport is used to producing. But here's the turn nobody in that crowd wants to think about too hard. None of this guarantees anything on the court. Eala enters Cincinnati as the 17th seed, the highest of her career at this level, which earns her a first-round bye straight into round 2, and that's the good news. The bad news is what comes after. Her likely opening opponent is either Romania's Elena Gabriela Ruse or Poland's Magdalena Frank, and both of them have beaten her before. Survive that. And the draw doesn't get kinder. A third-round matchup against Amanda Anisimova looms, a player capable of ending anyone's run on a given day. And beyond that, a potential 4th-round collision with Linda Noskova, and if by some miracle she claws through that too, Jessica Pegula is waiting in the quarterfinals. The same Pegula who publicly acknowledged her in Washington, and now stands as a wall between her and the deepest run of her career. This is not a soft draw stacked with favorable matchups to protect a hometown story. This is one of the hardest possible paths a 17th seed could be handed, and every round represents a real, tangible chance the fairy tale simply stops mid-sentence, in front of the very fans who flew across a country to watch it continue. And yet, walk through those stands and ask anyone why they're there, and you won't hear a single person hedge their expectations or brace for disappointment, one fan standing in that sea of flags. Put it as simply as it can be put. People are spending money they worked hard for to be in that building because they love her. They love her personality. They love the way she plays, and some athletes just have that thing that can't be manufactured or predicted, only recognized once it's already standing in front of you. And maybe that's the actual answer to the question this story opened with. Not a ranking, not a bracket, not a single statistic that can explain why a legend looked stunned in Ohio, but the accumulation of everything underneath it, a girl from a country tennis had overlooked for decades. refusing to soften who she is to fit into a sport that has rarely made room for someone like her, speaking in her native language during interviews instead of defaulting to something more palatable, appearing on the cover of Vogue Philippines and Tatler not as a novelty, but as a genuine cultural figure, and doing all of it according to the players who share locker rooms and practice courts with her. Without pretense, Danielle Collins has said she loves how comfortable Eala is in her own skin, how genuinely kind she is off the court, and when your peers describe you that way before they describe your forehand, that tells you something about why the connection with fans runs deeper than a highlight reel. In Toronto alone, tournament organizers reported that Eala'S presence generated roughly 5,000 ticket sales tied directly to her matches, 5,000 tickets. For a player who still isn't a Grand Slam champion, still isn't a top 10 fixture, still has more to prove on paper than almost anyone she'll face in Cincinnati. And that's the final piece of the puzzle, the one that reframes everything you just watched unfold. This was never really a story about rankings or seeding or draws at all. It's a story about what happens when a country that has waited its entire sporting history for one player finally gets her, and what happens when that player turns out to be exactly the person they needed her to be: unafraid, unfiltered, still capable of being moved to tears by a two-word comment from her childhood hero. Somewhere in that arena, Maria Sharapova is watching a version of herself she probably didn't expect to see again. A young athlete who idolized her the way she once idolized the champions who came before her. Except now the roles have quietly reversed. And the legend is the one in the stands, watching in something close to disbelief, while a girl who once sat in front of a television dreaming about this exact sport is the one the entire building came to see. And whatever happens in that brutal draw, against Rus or Frank, against Anisimova, against Noskova, against Pegula, one thing has already been decided long before the first ball is struck. The flags aren't coming down, the chants aren't quieting, and Cincinnati just became the latest chapter in a story that started with a 4-year-old picking up a racket and somehow improbably arrived at a legend standing frozen in a crowd she didn't see coming.